man acts in a mechanical way, reacting to external demands or instruction rather than in ways determined by his own interests and energies and power. He says we may admire what he does, but we despise what he is. For Humboldt, then, man is born to inquire and create. And when a man or a child chooses to inquire or create out of his own free choice, then he becomes in his own terms an artist rather than a tool of production or a well-trained parent.
Hello and welcome to episode 23 of the Diet Soap Podcast. This week's episode is entitled Dreams and Everyday Life. I'm Douglas Lane, the editor of the zine, and the host of this podcast. The guest this week is Penelope Rosemont. Penelope, along with her husband, Franklin Rosemont, were the founders of the Chicago Surrealist Group in 1966 with the encouragement of Andre Breton and the Surrealist Group in Paris. Penelope and Franklin were also both members of the Students for a Democratic Society, also known as SDS. If you're not aware of SDS, Wikipedia says that it was a student activist movement in the United States and one of the main iconic representations of the country's New Left. Just a moment ago, I mentioned that Penelope was the co-founder of the Chicago Surrealist Group, along with her husband Franklin. Unfortunately, Franklin died on April 12th this year, so it was especially gracious of Penelope to talk to me so soon after her loss, and I offer my condolences to her. Penelope talks about surrealism, revolution, and her new book entitled Dreams and Everyday Life.
Somewhere over the rainbow, way up high, there's a land that I heard of once in a lullaby. Somewhere over the rainbow, skies are blue, and the dreams that I dare to dream really do come true. Someday I'll wish upon a star and wake up where the clouds are far behind me, where troubles melt like lemon drops away above the chimney tops. That's where you'll find me, somewhere over the rainbow. Birds fly over the rainbow. Why, then oh why can't I? If happy little bluebirds fly beyond the rainbow, why, oh why can't I?
Penelope Rosemont, you are a painter, a photographer, a collagist, a writer. You're the editor of Surrealist Women, an international anthology, and the author of Dreams and Everyday Life, Andre Breton, Surrealism, Rebel Worker, SDS, and the Seven Cities of Cibola. And you and your husband, Franklin Rosemont, were the primary forces behind the Chicago Surrealist Group, which you formed in 1966 with the encouragement of Andre Breton. You were also a member of the SDS and later served as co-president of the MDS, which is a movement for a democratic society. So that's a brief bio for very much more detailed and exciting life. Do you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Well, no, it's pretty complete. The only thing that I could say is that one of the highlights of my life, of course, was meeting Andre Breton in Paris in 1966 and spending about 5 months meeting with the French Surrealist Group, which was just wonderful.
Right. That's right after that is when you formed the Chicago Surrealist Group.
Right.
Is that right? Yeah, I've actually been reading your book, Dreams and Everyday Life, for the past couple of days. I've gotten about halfway through it, and it's just a delight, actually, to read. I thought maybe we could start out with a couple of questions about that, about your book. You started writing the book in 1965?
Well, I used to take diary-type notes because I was interested in incidences of daily life. So when I went home at the end of the day, I'd write down interesting things that happened or interesting people I'd met. I had no idea I was doing a book. It was just part of thinking about what happened during the day and wanting to keep track of it. And yeah, I just enjoyed writing. So I had some notes going. Well, I probably have notes going back to 1960. So I just didn't even deal with 1960 because, I was in college then. So
did you keep notes like that and keep a journal going well beyond the 60s? Have you been doing that all your life? And do you think there's going to be a second and third edition of Dreams in Everyday Life?
Well, no, not actually. What happened is when you're young, you have a lot of time. You're a student. You're not really involved in things. But as SDS came along and we began getting busier and busier, my notes started to get sketchier and sketchier. But I would still write things down now and then. So I still have notes, but not on a daily basis.
Okay. So if you were to come up with another volume, it would cover a much broader amount of time than this one did, I would
Probably,
imagine. Yeah. But it's still worth doing, probably. Do you think that you were just lucky to have been born at the right time? Or do you think you would have found a similar scene to the one you found at Roosevelt University if you'd gone to school in the 80s?
Oh, I think I was lucky to be born at the right time. So, yeah, because the situation had changed greatly between the 60s and the 80s. The exploitation of everyone has increased greatly, and the schools have answered by trying to prepare their students in, well, would you say, a more practical way, and also in a more intense way. So I don't know that they really encourage the broad range of thinking that we had back in the 60s that was being actually encouraged in us by our professors. When there was St. Clair Drake at Roosevelt University, and he was a world-class thinker, it was just great to even hear one of his lectures. And, now Roosevelt is more of a business school. You go there and take classes in accounting and things like that. The political groups there are, I think, almost absent, whereas there used to be 10 or 15 different political groups contending for every person who signed up at Roosevelt. And, of course, it was the days of the civil rights movement, and it was dramatic to be able to express how you felt about things and then act on them by going on demonstrations and being in solidarity with people. And it was an intense period. I don't quite know how it came to an end, but like I say, the world changes, the exploitation increases, the pressure on people increases, and they don't have time to do that kind of thing.
Well, I just had a man named David Laibman on the podcast, and he's an economist, a Marxist economist at Brooklyn College, and a fingerstyle guitarist. He has a theory that there are stages to history. I mean, he's a Marxist, and he was saying that really since World War II, the pendulum has been swinging away from the working class and into a more repressive, very hyper-capitalist kind of mode, and that the 60s, I asked him if he looked back to the 60s as something that gave him not just hope and not just looking back with fondness, but also kind of a model for how to proceed, and he said that he thought the 60s were kind of a blip in what really from World War II had been a general tendency to swing against the working class and into a more repressive mode. Would you agree with that?
Well, in a sense, but part of the reason that repression has increased is because of worker militancy. One of the very first things that I remember was after the war, my grandfather absolutely celebrating the steel strike. There was a tremendous steel strike that the government had to interfere with and actually send people back to work. It was so militant that it shut down the entire steel industry. And that wasn't the only thing. The West Coast had increasingly militant Seamen's Union. And the Seamen's Union shut down San Francisco, literally. And so how can a capitalist class function if they can't guarantee their steel and their shipping? So they began being more repressive because they could see that worker militancy, I mean, after all, these people had fought in the war. They really wanted something, and when they came back, they were willing to fight for it. I mean, they were fighters. So basically, they did fight. And then, of course, there was later in the 60s, there started to be the insurrections in Detroit, which a lot of rebels and political people had concentrated their efforts in Detroit on that working class. And that working class was also very militant. And, of course, I mean, there were tremendous riots in Detroit. And again, how can a capitalist class function if they can't keep their working class under control? And their working class definitely was out of control, and they were worried like heck. So, of course, it's been more repressive, but the repression has, at every time, been an answer to a really strong revolt.
Well, I look back over the last 10 years, or the last 8 years, since Bush came into office and then left, as a time that was very repressive. And some would say that was in reaction to Seattle and the anti-WTO protests that were coming up in the late 90s. Would you agree with that we're seeing now as kind of a reaction to that moment of working class struggle then, or?
Oh, definitely. And then they don't admit it, but in fact, the demonstrators shut down the Republican National Convention a year ago or so. It wasn't really the hurricane that shut it down. It was the demonstrators that shut it down. They just used the hurricane as an excuse. Oh, we can't meet because of this hurricane. No. The demonstrators were so good. They had Minneapolis staked out in such a good way that the convention could not proceed. So they were really panicky, and they just called it off for a few days while they reorganized themselves and got those demonstrators out of the way. So, there again, it's an answer to militancy. Now, there's been all kinds of riots in L.A. too, and that's a very big port city. And even though the riots have been in the black neighborhoods, that's also pretty scary for guaranteeing that things are going to arrive on time and, being able to be delivered on time with no problems. So, I would agree with you that Bush has been bad, but I have to say that Clinton was the one that passed NAFTA, and that was such a dangerous bad thing. He did not do better than Bush. He was just as bad. And still, he put a smiling 60s face on it all. And so I find him a very disgusting character. And he's still out there doing a lot of damage, pretending to be a good guy. So I have a disdain for these politicians generally.
Yeah. I have been talking to a lot of people about Obama in a similar way as you were talking about Clinton, as someone who's come in and put a good face on essentially the same policies. But one thing looking back at Clinton that gets kicked around a lot is the fact that as damaging as he was to the left when he came into power, as much as he seemed to have diffused resentment and radical responses, we ended up in Seattle in 1999. We ended up being for socialist ideas being more mainstream. by the end of his 8 years. And I would say that maybe that's a danger of having a president that has to address, even in rhetoric, the ideas of the left, and that maybe that's something that could happen under Obama. I don't know. What do you think about that? That the Democrats might be weaker in repressing the left?
Well, here, I don't think the Democrats would be weaker in depressing the left if necessary. But here's the thing about Obama. He is really a triumph for our side. It was an impossible dream that this should happen in 1963. Impossible. Nobody in the world would have thought it could happen. And yet it happened. Now, of course, he's up there and basically pretty isolated. And he has to follow the orders of the capitalist class to some extent. And I think he's pretty powerful. But just the fact that the people elected him, and they did that, they crossed that racial boundary, and they voted for the smartest, best guy. Not the richest guy, not the guy that was a hero. They voted for the smartest guy. And that just shows something about the fact that the ideas that were alive in the 60s have become very pervasive in the society. That we really wanted to hope that things could change, and we wanted this man who represented a group of people that have been oppressed to represent us. So, now, that said, I don't know what is going to happen with Obama. Look at what happened in South Africa with the people there, the ANC, who managed to get into power. Some changes, of course, have been good, but basically it's still a capitalist country. And of course, they knew that the only chance to, I would say at this point, the bourgeoisie knew that their only chance to rescue themselves was to find somebody, that represented the people who would also preserve them. So it's an interesting period in history, and I look forward to the next few years to see what will happen.
If Colin Powell had been elected president, would you feel that that was just as significant as Obama's election?
Almost. He's an independent thinker, even though he's a Republican. He's a pretty independent thinker. And I think an honorable person, which is kind of amazing for somebody in politics. But I'm mostly an anarchist, so I have a great deal of disdain for politics. But I just generally enjoy following it. The mere fact that the Republicans had to pull Condoleezza Rice and Colin Powell out of somewhere and put them into office is, of course, pretty remarkable also. Yeah,
well, that's true. Yeah, that's true. And there's definitely no getting around the fact that when it comes to racial politics, that we are in a very, very different place, and a better place than we were in 1966. And even Condoleezza Rice, I guess, is a symptom of a sign of that progress. So it's hard for me to swallow that.
I know. Oh, good.
But yeah, and I'm not sure I agree with you about Colin Powell being honorable either. But we'll move on from that.
Well, as a Republican, he supported Obama, which is kind of like, what?
Yeah, but yeah, okay, but that's not. But I just remember him in front of the UN, and
oh yeah,
holding up the vial saying that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and I just don't know. I mean, I saw, frankly, his endorsement of Obama as something that made me feel less secure about Obama, rather than more secure about Colin Powell.
Well, that's one way to look at it. The paranoid method always works.
Well, I mean, I don't think it's paranoid to. Well, anyway, yeah, okay. I want to get into asking you about your book here.
The maze really is the guy within the United States more than anybody else who sort of brings to the table psychological theory as something that is an essential part of how, from the corporate side, of how we are going to appeal to the masses effectively. And the whole sort of merchandising establishment is ready for Sigmund Freud.
Yes, we can. It was sung by immigrants. They struck out the shore, pioneers, pushed westward against the unforgiving wilderness. Yes, we can. Yes, we can. It was the call of workers organized. Women reached for the ballots.
What the corporations realized they had to do was transform the way the majority of Americans thought about products. One leading Wall Street banker, Paul Mazur of Lehman Brothers, was clear about what was necessary. We must shift America, he wrote, from a needs to a desires culture. People must be trained to desire, to want new things even before the old have been entirely consumed. We must shape a new mentality in America. Man's desires must overshadow his needs.
Yes, we can. Yes, we can to opportunity and prosperity. Yes, we can to opportunity and prosperity. Yes, we can heal this nation. Heal this nation. Yes, we can repair this world. Yes, we can.
Extraordinary success and captured America's imagination.
Yes, we can.
The vision it portrayed was of a new form of democracy, in which business responded to people's innermost desires in a way politicians could never do. But it was a form of democracy that depended on treating people not as active citizens as Roosevelt did, but as passive consumers. Because this, Bernays believed, was the key to control in a mass democracy.
We've been asked to pause for a reality check. We've been warned against offering the people of this nation false hope. But in the unlikely story that is America, there's never been anything false about hope.
So democracy is reduced from something which assumes an active citizenry to the idea of the public as passive consumers, driven primarily by instinctual or unconscious desires, and that if you can in fact trigger those needs and desires, you can get what you want from it.
That the only chance to, I would say at this point, the bourgeoisie knew that the only chance to rescue themselves was to find somebody, that represented the people who would also preserve them. Yes, we can. Of course, many of them fought in the First World War, and they were horrified by it. It was such a terrible war on a personal level because people were in these horrible trenches, freezing cold, being shot at, dying of pneumonia. They were just in them for months and months and months, and just thousands and thousands of people died. Compared to our war today, it was just a massacre. And so when they came back from the war and they realized that the bourgeoisie and the government had learned absolutely nothing from the war and the suffering of the war, and that they were still promoting nationalism and all of those things that go with it, they had a great revulsion against Western civilization in general. And they looked around toward other things like African civilization and Asian civilizations. They were searching for something else. And they also looked toward communism because the Russian Revolution had happened during that time, and it was being celebrated as a whole new world. And so they joined the Communist Party, but they were pretty soon deluded with it because, in fact, the Communist Party was a very toe-the-line, repressive sort of thing, and that was the last thing they wanted. And they wanted their own personal freedom and the freedom of their imagination, and they couldn't take socialist realism and the policies that you had to descend the line.
Right, and towards the end of his life, Breton was more of an anarchist and syndicalist maybe than he was a communist. Is that right? He
worked with the anarchists, the French anarchists, on several campaigns. He was a great admirer of Charles Fourier, the utopianist, at that time, and he was studying Fourier's works on passional attraction and kind of the communes that Fourier wanted to organize. So, he had a utopian streak there at the end of his life. He wasn't going to give up on making a better world, on changing a better world, even though some of the things that he had been part of had been, defeated.
How do you feel about standing where you are now, looking back, and do you feel that you're still working and just as revolutionary as you were then, even though maybe to some degree some of what you were after has been defeated?
Well, yeah, although there's been a lot of victories too, like I was mentioning, every time they come out with more repression, it's often in reaction to the accomplishments that people have had. They just try to forget that. There's an amazing, when they write history, and they are in charge of writing the history that gets on the news and on the TV and in the history books, when they write it, they leave us out. So, and they leave the things that we've done out, which is one of the things that Charles H. Kirk Company tries to do, is to keep alive the people's struggle and show how it relates to what's going on. So I really think that there's been a lot of remarkable things that have happened, and they've been wonderful and unexpected. And, of course, the state gets stronger and huger, but at the same time, it gets more unwieldy. So they're entering, and of course you never know what's going to happen because they have computers now, but they're, and so do we, but they're entering a phase where their bureaucracy, their state, their global reach is getting pretty unwieldy. How to control all that they have to control, how to keep it down. And that's pretty amazing because you think that just one little thing could break down the whole system of communication. After all, when I was in school, the British Empire, the sun never set on it. I was in grade school when that happened. And heck, it is in little pieces now. And that was partly because of the invention of the airplane and several other inventions that happened. But it was also because of the revolutions in Africa and everywhere else, and it is gone. So, but there is one thing I want to mention. We are working on a leaflet that Gail Ahrens decided we needed to do. And it's about the fact that there is a NASA project in which they have sent up a satellite full of explosives. And the idea is that this satellite is an exploratory satellite. They're going to circle the Earth a few times. And when they get it lined up with the moon, they are going to hit the moon at the pole. And it's supposed to explore for water. Okay, so this is pure research. It's being billed as pure research. But as a matter of fact, I know a little bit about this, and the intercontinental ballistic missile never worked because it was just a lie, because of the fact that the magnetic fields of Earth vary too much. And so if you tried to send a missile, 3,000 miles, you might hit your target, or then you might hit something 300 miles away because they couldn't adjust it for the magnetic fields. However, with this new experiment, they're pointing at the moon, but they can also target anywhere on Earth in the same way. So you see, it's a step toward the enforcement of, global hegemony. And it's a step toward global warfare. It's a step to saying, okay, you might be in Afghanistan, but we can nuke you in any case. Or you might be in Tierra del Fuego, but don't think you're safe because, we can get you there too. So I'd like people to be aware of this moon mission. It's not purely scientific.
Well, I want to take a step back and ask you a couple of kind of larger questions about surrealism, because I take it for granted that everyone knows that surrealism is more of a revolutionary movement than it is just an art movement. But maybe I should give you a chance to explain that in your own terms and how you came to that position. And there are a lot of people who call themselves surrealists, and who are artists or writers who feel that they are aligned with surrealism, but don't think about it as political at all. It's more like magical realism or some other fantastical genre.
There definitely is a divorce between the art of surrealism, maybe even some version of surrealist writing, and the surrealism that I talk about, because, of course, capitalism tends to corrupt and try to absorb, make commodities out of everything. And so pretty soon you find Magritte being used to advertise Coca-Cola, because it's an image that is striking no matter what, but paired with something else, it can bring the power of that association to it. So people do try to steal from surrealism and its power, and they are fairly successful at it. And it's one of the reasons that the Situationists had an anti-art sort of tendency, because they could say, surrealist art has been absorbed and we have to disdain art, stick to being more political and try and discover other things. And they were very big on détournements, which also have been absorbed. But that's part of the process. We invent something, they try to corrupt it. We invent something else, they try to corrupt that too. But we think our creative imagination basically can stay ahead of them. And we are definitely hoping that that is the case, so that we can still communicate a revolutionary and life-changing message through our works. And of course, most of the people who consider themselves political surrealists and surrealists in the movement are in touch with each other and in touch with people in Paris and people in Prague who have been in touch with Andre Breton. So it's a chain of development. We consider ourselves distinct from the commercial surrealists. Of course, it's hard for the average person to know, but that's our job, to try and make them aware of the difference.
Do you think that the current economic crisis is making more radical change more likely or less likely?
Well, I don't know. It's a little hard to say. When there's an economic crisis and people don't have a level of consciousness, they tend to become demoralized. And I don't know what the level of consciousness is. The fact that they elected Obama shows that they do have some kind of level of consciousness. But I'm not really sure where it's going. It isn't as though this country was full of revolutionary groups who are, just waiting to organize and, redistribute everything. So, and like I said, it's a big country. It's very decentralized. What happens in Portland is not what happens in New York. So it's very difficult to say. But the scandal after scandal reminds me of something very much that happened before the French Revolution of 1789. People just couldn't put up with any more scandals. It kept coming out that such and such had stolen this amount of money, and these people had stolen that, and so the people began to be very aware that they were never going to get a fair shake from the government they had. And then, of course, they called an emergency convention, which the emergency convention, while supposed to be just a sort of, what would you call it, interim suggestive kind of convention that was supposed to help with reorganizing the government, that was held in some tennis court of all places, got it into its head that it was a revolutionary bunch, and they started the revolution right there. It was definitely aided by people in the streets who were marching around demanding it. But you just don't know. You don't know what is going to get out of hand and how changes are going to be made. In a computerized world, it seems very difficult. But on the other hand, computers can be shut down in an instant. So I don't know.
So now I had a question here that I didn't get to about the 7 cities of Cibola. Where are they? What are they? Did Scrooge McDuck ever find these cities?
Well, when the conquistadores were out searching for gold in the southwest, what they were looking for was the 7 cities of Cibola. The legend was that the streets were paved with gold. And so they were out searching the deserts and everything for them. But the truth is the 7 cities of Cibola were the Pueblo civilization. And how they got paved with gold, I don't know. But the fact of the matter is that they were, in a sense, perfect. And so gold describes a kind of perfection. And maybe somebody in translation got mixed it up. 7 perfect cities with 7 cities of gold. So the conquistadors were actually out there looking for gold. And of course, I love the Pueblos. I love their way of life. And Scrooge McDuck in the comic, they're out searching in the desert and they're looking for arrowheads, and they accidentally stumble on the 7 cities of Cibola, but they're followed by the terrible Beagle Boys. And the Beagle Boys are just entranced with the 7 cities because there are treasures there. There's a large emerald idol, and they can read a little bit of this one language. So Scrooge says something about it. It says, "Do not touch on this art." I think this is how it goes. But of course, the Beagle Boys don't know this, and they grab this emerald idol. It destroys everything. Everything is destroyed. It was a kind of keystone, and so it destroyed all the cities. And they just, all of them get out of it with their life, and they can't even remember having been there. And so to me, it's a little parable story about greed and how it can wreck the most beautiful dreams.
It's only a paper moon hanging over a cardboard sea, but it wouldn't be make-believe if you believed in me. Yes, it's only a canvas sky hanging over a muslin tree, but it wouldn't be make-believe if you believed in me. Without your love, it's a hard It's a melody played in a penny arcade. It's a Barnum and Bailey world, just as phony as it can be. But it wouldn't be make-believe if you believed in me. If you believed in me. If you believed in me.
I wonder if you're familiar with the Diet Soap podcast.
No, I'm not. Tell me about it.
Well, it is a podcast which was in part inspired by the C-Realm podcast. It was a print zine and an online zine, and the host, Doug Lane, he says that he thinks of his podcast as part of an ongoing conversation that takes place in a public space between the various podcasters. And so he's familiar with your podcast, and I think listens to it regularly, and he listens to the C-Realm, and he listens to the Kunstlercast, and in many other podcasts as well, and he frequently puts together montages from different podcasts to sort of show how, there are certain themes that are circulating through all of them, even though, we're not necessarily doing it deliberately or consciously.
Well, that's really fascinating. What's it called again?
Diet Soap.
I'm going to have to go out and listen to that. It sounds really fascinating.
Do you ever dream in cartoons?
No, never dream in cartoons.
Never?
No.
Yes. Why do those truthers want to believe what they believe? That's an excellent, well-reasoned question that couldn't possibly be directed at people who believe the official government story of 9/11.
Well, what I do is I talk about David Shaler because he was part of the 9/11 Truth Movement. David Shaler blew the whistle because he found out there was MI5 or MI6 were going to do something because of an assassination plot involving Colonel Gaddafi. A lot of people, innocent people, were going to be killed, and he found out that this was going to be done without the permission of the Foreign Office, which meant that it would be illegal even for, with those with diplomatic immunity to do it. But he got involved with the 9/11 Truth Movement, but then recently he started declaring that he's the Messiah, and he's become a transvestite. It's like he got knocked over by a hurdle on the way to an awakening.
Do you ever dream in cartoons?
No, never dream in cartoons.
Never?
No.
We're coming up, Doug and I recorded on 9/9/09, which this year is the Wednesday that falls closest to 9/11. So that's our topic of conversation. But I'm really ambivalent about the topic this year. And that's a large part of the theme of the episode is that I'm ambivalent about it, and most of the people that I try to get to talk about it are ambivalent about it and don't really want to be associated with the topic.
Do you ever dream in cartoons?
No, never dream in cartoons.
Never?
No. When I took LSD in the 60s, I had LSD visions in cartoons, and it got completely out of control. I couldn't stop it, and that's where a lot of my whole kind of like cartoon vision came from.
Initially, before that, he was involved in the 9/11 Truth Movement, and I just wonder what the hell has happened to that man.
Well, one could, take a sort of controlled dip into the pool of paranoia and say that maybe, he didn't fall off the sanity wagon, but he may have been pushed. Not necessarily only by the tough circumstances that he had to endure, but maybe by some, deliberate psychological manipulation or subtle tortures that were applied to him.
Yeah, I haven't ruled that out.
I wonder if you're familiar with the Diet Soap podcast.
He didn't fall off the sanity wagon, but he may have been pushed. Not necessarily only by the tough circumstances that he had to endure, but maybe by some, deliberate psychological manipulation or subtle tortures that were applied to him.
Do you ever dream in cartoons?
No, never dream in cartoons.
Never?
No.
Well, that just about wraps up the 23rd episode of the Diet Soap Podcast. This week I didn't receive any email or donations, but if you'd like to email me, write to douglane@dietsoap.org. And if you'd like to donate, go to dietsoap.podomatic.com and click on the PayPal button. Or send me an email and get the address to send a check. I do appreciate every donation, and I do have to pay for bandwidth and Skype and so on. But just as important to me as donations are emails, I really like to get word from the people who are listening. So if you're listening, please write me, especially if you have anything to say, even if you don't. But anyhow, just let me know you're out there. This week's music was from a musician named Isto, or Isto, I-S-T-O. He is the one playing guitar and singing Over the Rainbow and Paper Moon, and his is the music you just heard in the collage conversation. After being praised by KMO for presenting montages of other podcasts on this podcast, I've decided that such montages will become a regular feature at Diet Soap. So this week's conversation was between the Electric Politics Archive, the podcast Shamanic Freedom Radio, the Corbett Report, and KMO's Sea Realm. And who was it who kept being asked if he dreams in cartoon images? That was Robert Crumb, of course. And Crumb does not dream in cartoons. Never. I want to thank Penelope Rosemont again for participating in the podcast, and to let you know that you'll find links to her book as well as to Isto's music in this week's show notes at dietsoap.org. Okay, so moving on from one regular feature to another, it's time for the Titanic factoid. Miriam?
All right, this week I decided to talk about the children on board the Titanic. There were 5 children in first class, and 22 children in second class, and 76 in third class. And they ranged from the very wealthy Carter family, in which there was 11-year-old Billy and 14-year-old Lucille, to the Sage family, who had 9 children, and the very youngest child on board I've talked about before, that was 2-month-old Milvina Dean. She was traveling also with her parents and her 1-year-old brother Bertram. She died this year. So those were the kids, and they... The kinds of things that they did on the Titanic were really the kinds of things that kids do anywhere. They ran around in the areas that they were allowed to get to and played. The children in the first class could go to the gymnasium, and there was a mechanical horse there that they could ride around on. They could attend concerts in the evenings. I can't imagine that would have been really fun for them. In second class, the kids would play board games. There was a library in second class that kids could read in. Maybe the kids in third class had the most fun. They would run all over the place in the steerage areas, playing games, of course. Frank Goldsmith, who I mentioned briefly last week, remembered swinging on the baggage cranes and getting his hands covered with grease. He met a group of other kids, and they ran up and down the stairs, explored every part of the third class. Apparently they could even look down into the boiler rooms and wave at the stoker shoveling coal. And since there were so many kids in third class, I'll bet there were a lot of friends to choose from. And apparently one of the things kids liked best about traveling in the third class areas of the ship was getting to sleep in the bunk beds. So there you go, the kids on board the Titanic.